talk. So today we have two speakers today. We have Carly Daniels, Dr. Carly Daniels and Dr. Katie Orchel, both from the University of Exeter down here in Penryn, and they're going to talk to us all about seaweed aquaculture and the work they've been doing there. So Katie and Carly, if you'd like to take it away.
Certainly. Thank you ever so much for the intro. I'm going to try and share my screen. Okay, so thank you ever so much for coming along to listen to myself and Katie today. We're both going to be talking about seaweed farming in the southwest, but coming from slightly different perspectives. So Katie's coming from kind of a social science perspective, and my work's really focused on the kind of technical parts of seaweed farming and how to make it better. So without further ado, I will start my part of the talk. So I'm going to be talking to you about a project that I've been working on with the University of Exeter for the last year. It's a collaborative project between the Cornish Seaweed Company, West Country Mussels of Foy, Plymouth Marine Laboratories, but the project has also been closely linked with a parallel project run by the Marine Biological Association as well. My work has focused on practical aspects of seaweed farming. So establishing environmentally and sustainable techniques for rearing seaweed out at sea. The project has developed a pilot scale site in Porthallow Bay in Cornwall. For any of you that know Cornwall, it's a lovely little bay, sheltered bay just off the Halford. It's a very nice place to have a seaweed farm. And it provides a test bed, really, not only for this project that I've been looking at, but for other projects as well. I believe Sophie Corrigan is in the audience today. She's doing a PhD looking at the biodiversity benefits of seaweed farming. And the parallel project that I mentioned earlier is also looking at kind of natural recruitment of seaweed to the farm. So there's lots of things going on at this farm. So it's a very exciting farm. So I'll just start by kicking off with a brief introduction and then move on to explain the project that I've been working on. I think you're probably all aware that there's an ever-increasing human population and aquaculture is becoming a key player in helping to meet these increasing protein demands. Also, it plays a role in reducing the reliance on capture fisheries as well. So it's kind of a step forward in the right direction with regards to sustainability, certainly the forms of aquaculture that we're looking at. But with rapid expansion in aquaculture that the industry's seen in the last 10 to 15 years, it's key that the kind of sector actually expands sustainably, and it learns from lessons from other sectors, so agriculture, also other forms of aquaculture as well. The need for sustainable aquaculture development is actually recognised by the UK government, and it's been mentioned in the UK Marine Bill and also in the Fisheries Bill as well. And through the Seafood 2040 programme, England actually hopes to achieve a thriving seafood sector through sustainable fisheries and also a significant growth in the aquaculture sector. And this is where kind of developments in things like seaweed farming come into play. There is an increasing interest in marine aquaculture. They call that mariculture for short in the southwest of England. And there's been particular interest in what we call extractive forms of aquaculture, and that is aquaculture that requires no feed inputs. So things like shellfish farming, so mussel farming, oyster farming, and seaweed farming. Also, kind of on a global scale, algal production, which is portrayed on the graph that you can see in orange, it makes up a large proportion of aquaculture. The majority of this, though, is actually produced in Asian countries, and the UK is actually relatively new to seaweed farming. It's in its infancy in the UK. So I'll just explain a little bit about what seaweed's used for. Some of you may know this, some of you may not, but it's just a brief introduction. The majority of seaweed biomass is currently used for nutrition sources for human food, but there is a diverse market out there for seaweed derived products. So as a food, the most common examples of seaweed uses are in sushi, which I'm sure all of you know about nori, and the kind of seaweed that's wrapped around sushi. It's actually a red seaweed that's dried and then wrapped around the products. Also, there's kind of dried seaweed products, things like the Cornish Seaweed Company produce, which is just dried and then kind of flaked up, or it's put in with salts. But I'm sure if I asked the audience today, I'd hazard a guess that many of you think that you probably haven't even tried seaweed. But I'd have to say that you probably should be surprised to know that seaweed is actually used as a food ingredient in many other food items. So, for example, carrageenan and agars, which are both extracted from red seaweeds, alginates, which are extracted from brown seaweeds. They are used as thickening agents and binders in foods, including kind of puddings, milkshakes, sweets, chewing gum, ice cream, jams. There's loads of them to name, but basically I'd probably challenge you to go and look in your cupboard and have a look and see what you can find that's got these kind of seaweed extracts in them, so the carrageenans, agars and alginates, and you'll be surprised. I think you'll probably find quite a few of them. They're also used in cosmetics, medicines, they're used as health supplements, fertilizers as well, more recently bioplastics and biomaterials. So a London-based company, actually, this picture here that you can see above the bioplastics and biomaterials is kind of an algae pod, basically, and they use it to hold water, and the London Marathon actually used this to replace water bottles in the most recent London Marathon. So it's just a way of reducing the use of plastics. More recently, seaweeds have also been tested for the use of biofuels, but the economies of scale are quite limiting at the moment, although things are looking up on that front as well. So why are seaweeds important, and why are seaweeds so good to rear for aquaculture? They've got a large market potential, as I just explained on the last slide. They also have high productivity and fast growth rate, which makes them a good candidate species for aquaculture. So they grow fast, so you can produce a product very quickly and get return on your investment, which is all good for the aquaculture farmer. They also don't compete with other food production industries for things like space on land or fresh water. They've got potential to provide ecosystem services as well. So the four bubbles that you can see at the bottom there are examples of the ecosystem services that they have potential to provide. There's probably a little bit more work that needs to be done here to kind of prove the worth of these at different scales and in different countries and with different species. But there is a lot of potential for seaweed to kind of absorb nutrients and release oxygen into the environment. So this has a potential to reduce eutrophication. So that's just when nutrients in the water build up and the oxygen depletes in the water, and then you get blooms of algae and things that are harmful to the environment. So seaweed has potential to do that by taking up the nutrients as part of its general growth process. The canopy of the kelp also has potential to kind of dampen waves, which reduces the wave forces that go towards the land masses and therefore provides coastal protection. Seaweeds also, through the process of photosynthesis, where they take in carbon dioxide and convert that to oxygen, they have the ability to start to store carbon. So they convert the carbon dioxide, take out the carbon, and then release oxygen, which is potentially useful for reducing ocean acidification. They also provide shelter and habitat and food for other species, and as such have the ability to increase biodiversity in areas. And this is something that Sophie, the PhD student I spoke about earlier, is looking into. So wild seaweed harvest in the UK has been carried out for centuries, but the culture of seaweed hasn't been done so much. It is in its infancy in the UK, although having said that, their seaweed farms seem to be popping up all over the place at the moment. There aren't any current known estimates of seaweed production in the UK, and there are only a few commercial farms that are officially running as we speak at the moment. So the Cornish Seaweed Company have a drive to sustainably harvest seaweed. So they normally harvest from the natural wild population, but they took an interest in seaweed farming to allow them to sustainably harvest at levels that allowed them to kind of produce more as well. So if they have a seaweed farm alongside doing their natural harvesting, this was a very positive thing for them. And that's really where my journey started with seaweed, only about a year ago. So I'm not a true expert in seaweed. I've only got a year's experience, and the Cornish Seaweed Company certainly have a lot more than me. But I'm getting there. So I'll just introduce the site and what we did. So in 2019, we set up a pilot scale experimental seaweed farm, which was linked to an existing mussel farm in Porthallow Bay. The seaweed system that is used uses the same infrastructure as a mussel longline system. So it's a horizontal line that's suspended below the water surface and dropping down off that vertical, what we call droppers, which hold the seaweed. So we seeded the site back in November 2019 with a kelp called sugar kelp. It's Latin name Saccharina latissima for those that are interested. We used a natural binder to do this. So basically a seaweed glue that allowed us to stick the seed to the droppers. And we did this in two different methods. So we had a one-stage seeding method and a two-stage seeding method. The one-stage seeding method involved mixing the seeds, so the small gametophyte stages of the seaweed, up with the glue and then surface coating it onto the line. The two-stage method, so we applied the seed first and then we applied the glue as a surface coat to basically seal in the seed onto the line and hopefully prevent it from being dislodged during the deployment process, but also once it's put out at sea and in those rough waves in November. So we were looking at those two different stage processes to see whether we can improve the production process. We also monitored growth throughout the time period that the seaweed was out, so from November to June. We looked at biometrics on the seaweed, so we looked at the holdfast, which is the bit that connects the seaweed to the substrate that it's on, the stipe, which is basically the tree trunk, if you were to represent it as a tree, and then the blade, which basically represents a leaf if you compare it to a tree. We then looked at product quality as well. So we used a process called hydrothermal liquefaction. So Plymouth Marine Laboratories were running this part of the project for us, and they broke down the seaweed into its constituent parts to see whether it could be used for other things, not just for direct human consumption. At various points around the site, we also monitored water quality, so temperature, pH, salinity, nutrient levels, chlorophyll. We also looked at phytoplankton and zooplankton abundance across the site to look at kind of the environmental effects of seaweed on the environment and then the environment on the seaweed. So whether it grew better in different environmental conditions or if it affected the environment itself. So I've included this beautiful diagram by Sophie, who's in the audience. If you want to see it, she's got a Twitter page, Seaweed Soph. It's a very useful diagram for explaining exactly what I was talking about. So the long line system I was talking about, and it also shows the environmental interactions that the seaweed farming has. I probably won't go through all of this now because we don't really have time, but feel free to look on Sophie's Twitter to read into detail in that. What did we actually find? So the experimental site produced approximately 2 to 3 tons of kelp per metre of header line, which was probably a little lower than we were expecting, but the binder process that we were using was slightly different to the normal process which is used, which is a twine. So they grow the seaweed on a twine and then wrap the twine around the dropper, but we were actually surface coating. So we saw slightly lower than we expected, but having said that, if you scaled that up to the density of kind of commercial farming, we'd be producing around 4 to 6 tons per header line, which isn't far off what you would expect anyway. So it could be a very useful way, particularly in probably sheltered areas, to connect the seed naturally to the line. We also found that the natural settlement of other species was quite interesting. So on the line, as well as the species that we seeded onto the line, other things settled as well. So we had furbelows, which is Saccharomyces polyschides, which is a seaweed that's got a really bulbous holdfast. You've probably seen them washed up on the beaches. But they seem to be very opportunistic, and they present a very interesting opportunity for multi-seaweed species culture, looking at kind of, they grow at different depths potentially to the Saccharomyces latissimus, so the sugar kelp. So it's an opportunity potentially to reduce the cost of seeding by having natural settlement of species. The seeding method also affected the production, so the growth of the seaweed. These findings are actually in process at the moment, so I haven't got any beautiful graphs to show you, unfortunately, but there was an effect there. There was also environmental effects, or potential environmental effects of the seaweed on harmful algal blooms, but this again is in analysis as we speak by an undergraduate student that's working with us. So harmful algal blooms, so this links back to the eutrophication thing I was talking about. So harmful algal blooms will use the nutrients in the water. Seaweed will use the nutrients in the water as well. So if you've got a large quantity of seaweed, they'll take up the nutrients, which means the harmful algal blooms won't then bloom. Harmful algal blooms actually provide a massive issue to mussel farmers. So this is interesting for the kind of integrated multi-species culture. So if you've got seaweed around a mussel farm, if they can prevent harmful algal blooms from happening, then the farms aren't shut down for long periods of time for the mussel farmers, which would be a good thing. The product quality was also assessed using the hydrothermal liquefaction process, but again, this is actually in the process of being stuck through the hydrothermal liquefaction. So we have no data on this either. So it's not as exciting talk as I'd have hoped. We were hoping to have all the results by now. Unfortunately, that's it. So if I let Katie start to introduce her social science project. I'll stop sharing my screen, Katie, so you can.
Thank you, Carly. That was it's great to see the results of your half of the project. Now, I will share my screen. Let me just do that. Share screen. So my name's Katie, and I moved to Cornwall last year to work at the Environment and Sustainability Institute at the University of Exeter. And I've been working on seaweed as part, Carly and I were funded by the European Maritime Fisheries Fund, so it's part of the same big umbrella project. But my side is human focused. So I'm a human geographer, and I've been working at the University of Exeter for about 8 years. And so my interests are concerns in terms of seaweed. And I must say now that I've been working with Tom Shanu, who's my supervisor. So a lot of this, we've worked on this together and shaped the project together. We're interested in, if seaweed farming did happen around the Cornish coast, how might it impact on people? So how would different groups respond? What might be perceived as a threat or a loss or welcomed? We just don't know. So we thought, while there's these scientific experiments happening, let's ask people what they think and feel about it. So these are the three sort of main research questions we devised. What ideas, concerns, expectations do the main marine stakeholders, and I'll come to those in a minute, have about seaweed farming? And that's bearing in mind that they probably, and my research has shown so far that people don't really know what seaweed farming is or looks like. How might different groups be impacted if it did develop and at different scales? And actually, where could there be synergies between existing industry, or maybe some trade-offs or some clashes? So we were just keeping it wide, and we wanted to speak to a diverse group and, yeah, to hear different voices. So just a bit about the methodological approach that we took for this part of the research project, or for our human-focused part of the seaweed research project. We needed something that dealt with people's thoughts and feelings and opinions and doubts and fears. So something that placed their subjectivity, who they are, right at the heart of it. Also, because seaweed farms are only in their infancy, that's a much bigger established industry and practice globally, but in the UK, it's just starting. So people don't know what it looks like. They might not have any ideas in their mind. So we had to do something that was exploratory and provided some stimuli for them to anchor onto something to start thinking about seaweed farming with. So something that was subjective, that was exploratory, and also creative. Because when we're talking about imagining the future and where people might fit well together, or industries might work together and collaborate, or where they might clash, you know, it requires some imagination. So what approach should we take? Now, as a human geographer, or as a marine social scientist, as I think I can now call myself, as that's an expanding discipline as well, I'd obviously take a qualitative approach. So less of the facts, but more of the thoughts and the feelings. And I know some science people will think, oh, that doesn't matter, how do you quantify it? That's not the point. You know, the stuff of life is charged with emotion, and the way science is done is imbued with emotion. So our approach cherishes that and seeks it out and seeks to tell its story. So we took an arts-based approach. And what I mean by that is we use, because it was future orientated and because it was imaginative and exploratory, we worked with a collaborator, and that was an illustrator based in Falmouth called Tom Hubman. And if you've gone to Espressini or the Poly, actually a lot of the places in town all use him, and he's designed their logo, so he's quite well known. And together with Carly and Ian in engineering, who she works with, and Tom and some other, and Tim from the Cornish Seaweed Company, we sat down and we discussed what seaweed farming could look like. And we decided to commission Tom to develop 3 different scenarios of what seaweed farming might look like, to spark the imagination. And I created a narrative for each one. And we decided to go from sort of very small scale to medium to a regional scale endeavour for seaweed across Cornwall. And we, you know, there's a little story there. So we presented those to the participants. And the reason is, and I've put it here, there has been a lot of research done looking at creating sustainable futures, and actually use of the arts in that process, and having something to sort through and work with and express thoughts and feelings and ideas can really help develop better ideas. So that was the logic behind the approach. Now, just to have a, or not a caveat, but to explain, our original plan was to take groups of participants, maybe up to 6 people from a time, from different walks of life. So direct marine stakeholders directly impacted by potential seaweed farms, so fishermen, water sports users, swimmers, sailors, yacht folk, so direct water users, and then other sort of adjacent coastals, so residents, holiday makers, the local harbour authorities. We wanted to get maybe between 6 and 8 representatives from those groups to come together in a focus group to look and handle the artworks. And we were going to have different sizes and shapes of different features like fish or boats or seaweed, and they could manipulate it and come up with their own desired scenarios. And we were going to do that in Falmouth, Foy and Newlyn, so 3 different coastal contexts, to see what people come up with. But obviously COVID happened, so we couldn't. So I went for the same number of participants from the same industries and the same locations, but it ended up being a face-to-face conversation on Zoom like this. So I'm going to take you through the scenarios. Now I've got all 3 here. There's the slide sort of made them look a bit funny. So it's a bit like Where's Wally? That's you know, these little things like spot the difference, not Where's Wally. But there's the one on the left is the 3rd scenario. That's regional, it's busier. And the top right is The medium scenario with mixed aquaculture that Carly was, sorry, I'm pointing at my screen, was just talking about, with the little lines that would be integrated with a mussel farm. And the bottom right corner is a very small scale one that would just be 1 or 2 people working a long line of seaweed in a very quiet area. So to give you an insight to the scenarios, I'll present them with a bit more detail. So small scale artisanal farming, that's what we called it, would be in a very, you can imagine as if you were participating in the research now, what I'd be saying. So a sheltered creek, there wouldn't be much intrusion visually if a small seaweed, couple of lines was set up in a very quiet context. And it would be a small boat using maybe, I don't know, there might be a porter cabin or a little shipping container to process the seaweed and a truck to take it off. So very, very small, low impact operation. And it could be, this could be for perhaps a fisherman wanting to diversify and try something new, if you can imagine that happening. Or maybe a completely new entrant to the marine economy who could buy the equipment and have a go. And these images are just snippets of a wider picture. Scenario 2, we called it the circular economy because it was based on mixed aquaculture, multi-trophic aquaculture, which is where, as Carly described earlier, mussel farms may, or other bivalve farms may also have seaweed integrated into their already existing sites. So the benefits of this one, and we did write benefits of each and maybe some cons in the narratives, but it's spatially efficient. You're not taking up any more space in the sea. It's symbiotic, it's ecologically friendly because of that symbiosis between mussels and seaweed. So the waste from mussels is absorbed by seaweed, they live happily together, and it can attenuate the negative impacts of those harmful algal blooms, which is a really big problem for mussel farmers. It will put them out of action for weeks, which means they just can't harvest and make money when blooms come in. So there's ecological benefits. And then it would be another line of income for the farm owner there. We also put into this scenario that perhaps if such a site existed, that all the biomass from the seaweed could be hauled up and at underutilized docks, or maybe revive some abandoned ones, bringing some regeneration onshore into the local economy. And we talked about a collaborative, sort of a cooperative of fishers and seaweed farmers working out of the same space in this one. So quite a positive scenario. And finally, this image was much more busy because it would have to be set, the seaweed would have to come in to somewhere that's got very deep port because it would be a big scale thing. So an already existing port like Falmouth perhaps, although we didn't name a location for any scenario. So this was offshore seaweed farming. It said 10 miles there, but to be honest, it doesn't have to be that far. But the idea was that it would be beyond the, it wouldn't be visible from the shore. It would be hauling in thousands of tons, and the biomass would be, taken by lorry through to a central refinery, maybe regenerating a heartland like Red Ruth, where the processes of separating it out into different elements like the carrageenan or agar that Carly mentioned earlier could happen. So we said we created a fictional industry called Kerno Seaweed Enterprises for this. And we said that there was a policy context where the government was pushing for seaweed to be the new sort of industrial theme for Cornwall, perhaps taking over something like what China clay was historically. Okay, so those are our 3 scenarios. But who did we speak to? So we decided, I sent out a lot of invitations, probably about 65, and I ended up speaking to about 25 people, quite in depth. So semi-structured interviews based around the scenarios. So you can see on the screen there, the marine-based stakeholders and more local, not land-based, but groups that didn't depend upon the marine economy for their income. And there was overlap. You know, a lot of fishermen are also can be sailors. Divers are often yachtsmen, I found out, and residents could be all in the category above. So I transcribed all the interviews, I recorded them, transcribed them word for word, and then coded them using a program that lets you highlight and identify themes, and then you can do a cross comparison across the different cases, the different types of people or different places that I interviewed people from. Okay, so I've done an initial analysis, and it's not official and it hasn't been written up yet, but you're going to be privy to it now. So what did we find out? Some emerging themes here. I'm just going to have to minimize my screen because I can't see the last three. Okay. A lot of people were very, I'm not going to cut it by group yet because we need to do some more work on that, but in broad terms, people thought it was really interesting. They quite like looking out and seeing something on the horizon, especially if it's a local industry like fishing or that's in keeping with the sort of town. You know, it's a view on the horizon. It could be good if it wasn't alternative income for fishers, especially with fisheries in decline. There is a real need and a desire for a permanent year-round economic base in Cornwall that goes beyond just seasonal tourism. So that was a really strong appeal if seaweed farming could feed in and provide that more stable economic base. Some people thought, well, it could be great, it might bring tourists down, or if there's more income coming in, it would regenerate the towns and would improve the tourist offering in general. It could help strengthen the character of a town. I'll come onto that a bit later. And another theme was that actually, with all those wonderful potential applications of seaweed that was mentioned earlier by Carly, it can actually help feed into creating a sort of sustainable products or local protein to go into restaurants and link up with other eco-green initiatives. Like somebody mentioned, I think down in Penzance, there's zero plastic Penzance, and so, you know, it could twin with that. Okay, and these were slightly more actually sort of concerns that people expressed. Big concern was this displacement of the fishing. If farms took up more sea space, where would the fishermen go? It'd be a direct impact on their income, but also the idea that then they would be displaced and would be impacting on other sites that people would be using, marine users and fishers, so there could be overcrowding. Another really big theme was that there was this almost fear and resistance to any threat to change in character of towns, especially more traditional fishing towns, which won't be of a surprise, but that didn't really want fishing displaced sort of in the cultural imagination and what people think of it. And you might imagine, or anticipate, Newlyn was obviously a big one there. Some people found the sort of first scenario, that little, the one that'd be in creeks, actually fine if it was in keeping with the local aesthetic. So if they used for their buildings stone that was similar to original buildings, or if they used traditional methods like twigs in the water rather than buoys, people came up with really specific things that they would find acceptable, but at different scales. So I think the take-home message for that one around sense of place is that whichever scenario it was, it would have to be matching with the type of industry and the scale of activity that's happening on the marine scape in that place. Tourism. Now, it was actually, I couched this originally as a fear that it might pose, seaweed farming could pose a threat to tourism. So someone said, oh, if there was a big farm, tourist boats might have to reroute and they might completely miss our town and they'd go on to Falmouth, the next town, and that will really impact on the footfall here. That was a fear. And then some residents said, well, gosh, and they hadn't communicated with each other, if we had a reduction in tourism because of seaweed farming marring the pristine environment and this sort of this imagination of tourists that we have beautiful beaches, and we don't want it ruining with seaweed, if tourism declined, then actually that would have downstream impacts on the services available for local residents. So restaurants would shut up, bars would go, all the things that they enjoyed about their town, they worried might go. And I don't want to over egg this. Loads of people weren't worrying about this, but this came up and it showed some real, real thinking about all the different avenues and parts of life that could potentially be affected. And these are hypothetical suggestions. Zooming out to a bigger context now, to that locus of control, mainly for fishermen who responded, there was this sort of sense that, it could pose another thing that's just taking away our sovereignty over the sea. So with Brexit, they were really hoping that they could regain control, and that actually if this was just aquaculture was another thing that would impose on their freedom and right to the sea, that would be very frustrating. And also some said, we're already being squeezed with no take zones, so areas that are taken away for scientific, SSSI, special scientific interest areas, or marine protected areas. Seaweed farming could be just lumped in their mind and into that category as another space we can't go, and that was a threat. And finally, some interesting ethical questions came up, mainly by residents who said, but who, asking who would really benefit? Would it just benefit people who were already in the marine economy, so mussel farmers who had the equipment to develop seaweed farming? And there was a big worry from one lady about, would money go back to local people, or would it be taken away and put into businesses that are don't benefit local people? So lots of things were thrown up, and that's exactly why we needed to do the research, so we know what we're dealing with, and also that these concerns can be raised if and how seaweed farming goes forward, to make sure it's implemented better, taking the community along with it and in a more informed way. So just to return to the questions, these were the ideas, concerns and expectations. We've mapped out some of them, and there are themes amongst different social groups. And there are clear areas that there could be synergies, and one of the most positive, to finish on the positive, was especially in Foy, lots of different people felt that if there could be an industry that revived the docks and the underutilised China clay docks, that is a declining industry, that could be such a positive thing. So if seaweed farming can tap into that sense of place that exists, that was, it was people, there was a lot of hope around that and excitement. So I suppose it's finding a scale that's right for the town and how seaweed can be worked into that. Okay, that's it from me. Oh, I think I have to do the final acknowledgements actually, sorry, let me do that. So at the bottom are all the different companies that have contributed to both mine and Carly's research and the centres that we are part of at the university. And these are the people that we just want to say thank you to. So Carly, do you want to say anything about anyone here? I think we should name them.
Yeah,
so
definitely.
People can hear. So you go, Carly, go on.
Sorry, from my perspective, Ian Ashton was, I guess, the lead of the project that I was running, so I came up with the ideas behind it and kind of put all the hard work into getting the funding and putting it together and getting all the collaborations with the Cornish Seaweed Company. And Dr. Mike Allen is from Plymouth Marine Laboratories, but also linked with Exeter University, and he was in control of all the hydrothermal liquefaction. He was the chemist brain behind it all. And also Ross Brown, who's got a lot of interest in harmful algal blooms and the effect of farming potentially on water quality and things like that. Kat Wilding and Dan Smell from Marine Biological Association, who were running the parallel project. And also, I haven't put on there, but I should have put on there, Sophie Corrigan, who's doing the PhD, who's obviously helped out with a lot of the practical work and has been involved in the farm from the offset. And then there was photo credits to Kaylon Lamantia, who provided some very good footage, but also pictures from the seaweed site as we were doing our harvesting.
And I want to add Tom Hubman, the artist, who worked very hard with us to create those scenarios. Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, guys. Fascinating talk. And it's interesting to see two different angles of the same work, I guess. So for anyone that hasn't been along to a Café site before, what we do now is we take questions and discuss those, and I'll be chairing those. If you want to ask a question, the easiest way to do it is to put it in the chat, which you should be able to find where if you hover your mouse over the video that's playing, there should be a box that says chat towards the bottom. You can click that, that should bring up on the side of your screen, and you can type a question in there. So while people are thinking of questions and putting those in, I've got a couple that I wanted to ask. And actually, seeing as this is the first time that we've had two people discussing research on one of these virtual Café sites, I'm just interested to know, you're both looking at quite different aspects of the project there. Do you find that you two collaborate a lot, or actually do you end up doing a lot of it separately with this research?
Do you want me to take that one, Katie? Or?
Yeah, you go first, and I'll.
Yeah, you're that. Yeah, so I mean, I have to say some of the work definitely was done collaboratively, certainly when we were putting together the scenarios and talking about kind of how seaweed farming could be seen and what it was like. Certainly the physical expertise that I had of kind of running farms and stuff was a great benefit to Katie for understanding what scenario she should put forward, and I guess understanding the realities of seaweed farming and kind of the practical aspect of it. So there was definitely a lot of collaboration there. After that, I have to say, maybe not so much. Katie went off in a different direction speaking to people, and I ended up speaking to seaweed. So very different, different aspect there. But yeah, no, the two projects definitely work hand in hand. And if you think about the industry in general, it's not just about kind of the development of the practical techniques and technologies of how to do it. Quite a lot of the issues are around social science and around understanding the implications that the seaweed has on the environment, but also the people living in the environment. So that will also affect regulation for seaweed farming. So having an understanding of the environmental impact, but also the social impact as well, that all dictates what things will get passed at a kind of regulatory level. You have to have a marine license for running a farm, and to be able to get that, you have to show kind of your potential impact you might have. And having this social kind of understanding is really important to back up the ability to kind of have a practical farm out there at sea.
Yeah, it's interesting to see that sort of, I guess you go coming at it from a more whole perspective there rather than just one perspective. With it, is that this might not be a question that you can answer, but is that an increasingly common approach in science that you've seen?
Yeah, very much so. The whole system approach is definitely certainly taking off. And I know that Seafood 2040 are kind of taking this whole sector approach as well. That's the initiative that I mentioned at the beginning there about kind of sustainable seafood production, the seafood sector improving and increasing and having this ability to meet the protein demand. So having that whole sector approach is actually being taken by them as well. Of you need the ability to increase production, but to be able to do that, you need to understand everything around it, whether that be kind of improving the regulation and creating a framework that makes it possible for people to do it, or understanding the social impacts, or linking the two together. So linking that, the ability of people to apply for an application with obviously those people out there that say, oh, actually I might object to this application. So having that clear communication between people and science, I think is definitely in industry development is really kind of taking off from top down now rather than from bottom up, which is a good thing to see.
Absolutely. Following that up, actually, in terms of like you're saying, having the better communication and things like that. I think this might be one more for Katie. This one with the questionnaire and not the questionnaire, sorry, the conversations you were having with people there, and some of them raising different concerns. At any point, do those concerns get sort of addressed and then fed back again to those same people, or is that something that may or may not happen further down the road?
Thanks, Ben. So there'll be sort of several outputs really from the project. So there'll be a report that goes back to the funder, which does detail sort of the key findings. But yes, which I will let all the participants know about. But Carly and I are actually in discussion now about how we're going to write up these results. So they can be of benefit to the public. And that would mean, also being in touch with the big players in the marine field and governance, like the Marine Management Organisation or CFAS, perhaps. So, yeah, we're thinking about how we can maximise our impact, and this is one way, communicating through something like this. But obviously, the results are really they're just in their early form. It's a first pass.
Great, thanks very much. Okay, we've had a few questions come in here, so I'll start with David's question here, who says, thanks very much. Great to see a social science perspective on this as well. And David was wondering if there have been any similar studies elsewhere in the country. Is Cornwall's perspective on seaweed aquaculture unique?
Thanks for your question, David. There are a few studies. There are a few a few lone wolf studies, I want to say, because they usually, I haven't found many. I can think of two directly, one that looks at the Dorset coast and mainly talked with stakeholders who are really in marine management and planning. And what we wanted to do was talk to a broader base of people, of actual, local residents, water users, people involved in the hotel industry, things that make a town, the lifeblood of a town. So we wanted to go a bit wider to draw out different perspectives. I, by chance, bumped into someone at the Sustainability Institute's Café. I overheard him talking about seaweed, so I butted in. This is how you have to operate sometimes. And he said, oh, I've done a study sometime. He was from Durham University, and he did a perception study. I think it was up in the northwest of the country. However, that's not processed, and so he's waiting for someone to do that. But it does seem to be very localized, very sort of academic driven. Now, I think there are some people in the audience who are from either DEFRA or MMO who might have some contributions that I'd welcome as well, if they know of any other social perception studies. Yeah, but beyond that, internationally there are, can I just say, things like the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization do look at social and economic impacts of seaweed studies globally, looking at its impact on income, especially where there's a lot of fishers and local communities involved as a development strategy. Seaweed farming is often implemented in that context. And they do look at things like its impact on gender and family dynamics, but there's nothing like that in the UK. It's a different context completely.
Cool, thanks very much. Question here from Steve, who says, thanks, very interesting. What other seaweed species were considered for the aquaculture trial that was mentioned? I think Carly mentioned this. And why was sugar kelp chosen?
So you are correct in thinking it was the sugar kelp that was chosen for production. I mean, around the UK, sugar kelp is one of the most common reared species of seaweed out there. It's fast growing. It's got a large biomass. So kelps in general tend to have large biomasses compared to the kind of smaller green and red species of seaweed. So it is just one that there is quite a lot of information about already. So instead of starting from not knowing anything, we were starting from a perspective of people have done this. Let's try and do it in a slightly different angle using the same species. Certainly there is a lot of potential to use other species as well. There's a lot of interest in ulva, which is a green seaweed. They call it the sea lettuce. there's a lot of interest in potentially rearing that, not necessarily at sea, some of that's on land. There's also interest in rearing dulse, which is a red seaweed. It's kind of a peppery flavoured seaweed. They call it I guess the plant-based bacon. But it's, yeah, that's got a lot of potential for rearing as well. Again, that could be land-based or sea-based, but the kelps tend to be the most interesting species that are kind of, yeah, studied a lot within the UK for people that do kelp farming. So yeah, sugar kelp was actually chosen for me before the project, but I can see why, because of yeah, the what's known about it before. With regards to the other species, the species that I spoke about that naturally settled on the lines, the opportunistic species, that was another species of kelp, but that was Furbelows, Saccharomyces polyschides. That is, again, a very fast-growing kelp. It's got a very dense blade compared to sugar kelp. So with regards to whether it's useful for food sources, that's something that needs to be tested. It's quite leathery in texture compared to the sugar kelp, which is quite a delicate blade, so makes nice kind of seaweed flakes when you dry it. So from a human food perspective, sugar kelp is quite a good one for that, but maybe this other species might be very useful for breaking down into those other products of seaweed.
Brilliant, thanks very much. So yeah, another one here from Rebecca. It says, thanks both. Not sure who's best to answer, but best to answer, perhaps both. So yeah, which, from the perspective of the producers, and aside from the mentioned harmful algal blooms, what are the main risks they face, both environmental and economic?
I'll make a start on that one, shall I, Katie? And if you've got anything to add, please feel free. So with regards to seaweed farmers, harmful algal blooms aren't actually an issue for seaweed farmers. They're an issue for mussel farmers. So they'll, unfortunately, the mussels uptake the harmful algal blooms and cause things like paralytic shellfish poisoning, things like that. So they're bad for human consumption. So that's why mitigating the risk of these harmful algal blooms is a good thing for the mussel farmers. With regards to seaweed farming and kind of the risks that it may face, again, it's in its early stages, but obviously disease is always something that's brought up when you culture any species. So knowing a lot more about the diseases in seaweeds would be useful. I know that SAMS, the Scottish Association for Marine Science, are doing a lot of that work on that up in Scotland. So there's some information coming into the industry from that. Also, climate change is a potential impact, a potential threat to kind of the rearing of any species. Seaweeds are known to kind of, as with many species, their ranges change with temperatures. So it could be that if you're at the extremes of a species ranges, kind of north and south latitudes, then it might be that you can't rear certain species, but you can rear other species. So yeah, that could affect farmers. They're probably the biggest risk at the moment. Katie, I don't know if you can think of anything else, maybe from an economic perspective. I guess large loss of stock is always a big one. If you had a storm that wiped out your farm, then potentially that could be a big economic threat for you. Biofouling is actually potentially one. So the harvesting of kelp species and things it's quite precise. You have to make sure you harvest, certainly from a food perspective, because you need a high grade quality blade for food purposes. So you get lots of things settling on the blade and on the plant itself that potentially could be a negative for the product, although it's potentially a positive with regards to biodiversity and increasing that. Actually on the blade itself isn't necessarily wanted for food purposes, so you have to harvest at certain times of year to make sure that these other creatures aren't kind of settling and growing on the kelp. So that's maybe another one from an economic perspective. But having said that, that product could be used and broken down into its constituent parts with a clever chemical process that I'm not very good with. I'm definitely a biologist.
Brilliant. Okay, sorry, go on, Katie. Do you have anything to add?
I had something to add, because I was thinking, where's the question coming from? And I was wondering, from my conversations with people in the research, one of the worries that people had, because you asked about the risks, environmental or economic risk, some people were concerned. It comes from a place of not knowing, because we don't know yet. That's why we're doing projects like Carly's. Like, what about biosecurity issues? So what if seaweed breaks free and suddenly colonizes the whole area? There's a concern like, oh gosh, it could just invade. But, and I'm hoping Carly will correct, or, you know, not correct me, but tell me the exact measurements. But I think that seaweed that's going to be cultivated has to be sourced, like the reproductive material and the species has to be sourced within, is it 3 miles of the site or something? So it has to be indigenous to the local area that you're growing it in. Yeah,
that's pretty much correct. So basically, I don't know what laws and regulations are on this. Someone else in the audience might be able to answer that if they've got some knowledge. But basically, for the purpose of the farm that we were in, we made sure that the source material, which is the reproductive material, was sourced from within 1 kilometre of the farm. So it's definitely kind of local populations. We obviously don't rear invasive species either. That's probably another thing to mention. It's all native species to the area, and that's maybe something that could be deemed as a negative of seaweed farming if people were to consider rearing non-native species, even if the source material was collected from within 1 kilometre of the farm. So it all has to be, that's by law, that has to be native species that are reared.
The only other economic one, a risk would be if someone thought, I'm going to go all out and create a seaweed farm, and they got the license and then there was no market. So this is the other sort of demand side of it. So you could possibly supply it if we find a really good species and the right environment to grow it in. But there needs to be the demand and where it's being sold into. So that is the sort of other big piece that needs to happen policy-wise and commercially to support this industry. And one other element to that is there's a question around food security. And I know there's research being done as well on sustained levels of minerals that seaweed might absorb and what's safe for human consumption. So that's another bit of work that needs to be done in order to secure the market and create a safe food stuff, something edible. So that, yeah, that's a question mark there, and work will be done on that as well. Can you think of anything else, Carly?
No, I don't think so. I'd agreed with those points you just made, definitely. I think making the seaweed safe for human consumption is very important. Certain seaweeds have very high levels of iodine, the brown seaweeds, so you can't have too much iodine in your diet. It's making sure it's processed in a way that you don't have too high levels, or making sure you don't eat too much of it so that you get excessive levels of various parts of the plant. Yeah, no, I think that's probably it.
Great, thanks. Yeah, quite a variety of things there. So just a follow up here from Rebecca. So yeah, where the question's coming from, Rebecca's involved in global typology of small scale producers of aquatic foods, and we're missing this element and would love to chat. So we'll send an email. So you can expect a follow up from Rebecca. I've had a few more questions coming in the meantime. There's one here from Henry, and this is something we see quite a lot. Are there any figures which record how much seaweed is routinely cleared from tourist beaches, and whether this could be put to more commercial use? I mean, I'm not even sure what happens when they go over to, say, Gilly Beach in Falmouth and just pick up all the seaweed. I'm not sure, do they dump it back in the ocean? Do they bin it off somewhere?
So yeah, there's actually, so Mike Allen, who I mentioned earlier, is doing the hydrothermal liquefaction work for Plymouth Marine Laboratories. He's doing a project at the moment. Now I can't remember what country it's with, so I'm sorry, but it's somewhere abroad. I think it's in the Caribbean, where they basically kind of every morning you'd have people out shoveling the seaweed off the beach to make it acceptable for the tourists, and they're actually looking at kind of processing that biomass. And the processes that they use can actually break down all sorts from plastic and everything and separate it out into its constituent parts. So it can actually be used as fertilizers from that purpose, or even biofuels, or many other of the constituent parts that I mentioned before. So there is a use for that seaweed on the beach. Having said that, as far as I know, it's deemed in quite a few areas as a habitat, even when it's washed up on the beach. And I don't believe, and I might be wrong, someone might be able to correct me, that you can actually collect it from the beach. It's like collecting stones off the beach officially. No, you're not allowed to. So if the licenses were in place to be able to do it, then yes, I do feel that that product could be used, and certainly processes could be formed. Obviously, you wouldn't want to use it for food because it's already rotting when it's on the beach, because it's broken off the plant and it's breaking down, but you could certainly use it for other forms of the many other uses that I mentioned.
Great, thank you very much. We've got a good bit of information here from Debbie Whittle as well in the chat. So yeah, thanks both of you for a very interesting talk. I agree with Carly in that collaborations between different sectors is vital to gain more holistic understandings. And there's a lot of interest in seaweed farming presently, especially in the southwest. Agritech Cornwall has a specialty crops project with Plymouth University and Cornish businesses looking at cosmetics and pharmaceutical properties of seaweed. So that's great. Thanks for the contribution there, Debbie. Question here from Caroline that's just come in. Do you have any connections with seaweed farmers in Scotland? Interest in seaweed aquaculture is growing rapidly up here, and it'd be good to know that the knowledge is being shared, and would be great to chat sometime about projects up here. So it's great, great that you're tuning in from Scotland, Caroline. Which one would you like to field that question?
I can give it a go if you want, Katie. So yeah, thank you very much, Debbie, for your input there. There are a lot of other projects going on that possibly we don't even know about, so it'd be good to kind of talk to you and collaborate on what you're doing as well. And then on to Caroline, obviously. Yes, there is a lot of work going up up in Scotland, and they are definitely seaweed experts compared to me. There's the Scottish Association of Marine Science, SAMS, that I mentioned earlier, actually have 2 seaweed farms up in Scotland that they've been running for quite a while, and they do a lot of kind of environmental assessments, growing of different species, and they actually have their own hatchery up there as well, so they can provide the seed for these farms of many different species, and they've got a very good collection of kind of reproductive material up there that can be used for farms. So yeah, there is a lot of work going on up there. I can certainly put you in contact with SAMS if you are based in Scotland and the guys up there. But also we're obviously in talks with them and do work closely. They actually developed the biobinder or the biobinder process that we were looking at implementing. So yeah, they're in the know, they do know a lot, and yeah, love to collaborate between Scotland and down in the southwest.
Excellent. Yeah, there's another message from Debbie here saying that yeah, she'd love to collaborate with the NLH again.
I thought I recognised that name, Debbie. Yeah, sorry, my previous world is in lobsters and rearing of lobsters for stock enhancement for aquaculture as well. So a few people pop up from the past that I kind of recognise, but I'm not sure if they're seaweed people. So
NLH presumably standing for the National Lobster Hatchery in Padstow.
Yes, it does. Yeah. Yes, sorry, I didn't explain that.
Excellent. Okay, it looks like we're winding down on the questions here. I've got one more, and if anyone's got any last questions to put in, please do, and I'll read them out. But otherwise, we'll finish on this one. And this one's just out of curiosity, really. So I know the guys at the Cornwall Seaweed Company fairly well. But I'd just be interested to know how it all came about. Did they approach you? Did you approach them? Sort of, what was the thinking behind it in the first place? Because I know they've been going for quite a few years before this all took place.
Yeah, definitely. So I mean, they're very much about sustainably and having a sustainably harvesting and having a sustainable business model. The levels, basically, they're doing quite well in business now, and they're getting to the point where they don't feel potentially comfortable harvesting larger amounts just from the kind of natural populations that are out there. So they want to do something to put something back. So their interest in farming comes from being able to do something good for the environment, so helping with biodiversity, but also helping with not having to harvest so much from the wild environment. With regards to how it was set up, the project, I wasn't actually privy to that because I actually came on after the project was set up. But I believe that it was probably Tim getting in contact with local scientists and saying, look, I'm really interested in doing this. Can you help feed into the project, and what elements can you add?
Brilliant, thanks. I've had a couple of questions here. There's one from Katie here, which I think everyone can get involved with here. So Katie said, what do the audience, everyone here, think about seaweed farming? What would you like to see? And would you eat seaweed if given the opportunity? So I'd be interested just to see what people think, if you just want to put that in the chat there. And then we've had someone else here say, hi Carly, is lobster suitable for IMTA? I'm not sure what that is. I must confess my ignorance.
So IMTA is integrated multi-trophic aquaculture. So that's along the lines of, can you rear mussel, seaweed? Could you do salmon farming and seaweed together? It's just integrating different species of aquaculture that are maybe in different trophic levels within the water. So basically near the surface or near the seabed, or pelagically in the water column. So slightly off topic with that one with regards to lobsters, but we were looking at the potential for lobster aquaculture, and certainly lobster aquaculture, seaweed aquaculture, mussel aquaculture could all be linked together in the same systems, definitely, and work very nicely together. And the one from Katie, I think we should pass that over to the audience.
Yeah, so yeah, if anyone's got any thoughts on Katie's question there, that would be great to hear. We've got one from David here saying, be very excited about the seaweed industry after the talk, especially as an opportunity for Cornwall, and absolutely would love to and have previously eaten seaweed. So that's a good one. I've given it a try myself. I really quite liked it. I remember trying that. I can't remember which one it was now. The one that tastes like bacon. I remember trying that one. I was surprised at how close it was.
The dulse. Yeah,
that's the one. Dulce. Henry says, if it cuts imports and carbon use and can be set up sustainably quickly and could perhaps revive the decline in fishing industry, then I'm all for it. Steve's definitely keen. So seems like a pretty positive response from the audience here, guys, which is great. Yeah, super stuff. Well, and Debbie as well. We've got a few more coming in. Debbie says, yes, there should definitely be more investigation to seaweed farming here and working with local industry. We're definitely trying more seaweed and potential for a seaweed festival in the future, question mark. That'd be good. I mean, we get plenty of festivals down here in Cornwall, but I certainly don't think a couple more would hurt, especially on something so local. I think David has just popped a poll up there that everyone should be able to see on your screen. How do you feel about seaweed aquaculture? So far, out of the 19 of us that are left here, we've had 10 votes for a good idea and none for the other one. So that's good to see. Yeah. Okay.
I may have slightly biased that. I did just vote.
Yeah. I think that's quite all right. Brilliant. Well, I can't see what the username is, just user, but the message says, thanks, Carly. I'm from New Zealand and eat seaweed. So we have a lot of seaweed fans in tonight by the looks of things.
That's great.
Brilliant. Well, if there's no other questions, I think we might wrap it up there. What we usually try and do, we try and do an online round of applause. So David, if you don't mind unmuting everyone, we'll give that a go. And yeah, just say a big thank you to both you, Carly and Katie, for coming on today and talking to us. It's been really great. Thank you.